Great. Welcome, everybody, to our penultimate workshop. I'm delighted that Lawrence is going to be leading us with this one. And we're going to be, having talked about the history, or sort of very broad history of American music, and particularly folk song in the US, we're now going to have a focus on the sort of English folk song tradition, and particularly the revival. So I'm about to eat my lunch, so I'm going to turn my camera off so that I'm not munching food and distracting everybody, but I'm very much here and looking forward to what Lawrence has to say. So without further ado, thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks very much, Michael. Well, it's been really interesting doing a little research around this, and I'm mainly going to focus today just on the revival section. What we're really looking at here is how music looked in the sort of 1850s to 1900s, what brought about this idea of needing to look at folk songs, and why there was this rush to record folk songs and use folk song as the basis of a lot of material for classical music. And then just taking that through really to a couple of our Britain folk songs that we're obviously doing, and why Britain wrote those. So it's a bit of a mix today, but I'm rather hoping we'll listen to quite a lot of music as we go, hear a few things, and maybe learn a few things as we go on. I'll start with this. In 1904, there's a German called Oskar Schmidt, and he came over to England, and he wrote the following: "I have asked myself, what is missing from this nation? I have found something which distinguishes English people from all other cultures to quite an astonishing degree. The English are the only cultured nation without its own music." And this actually is a very, very fair comment. Around that time, what had really happened? Well, we had Wagner come and visit in 1865, and he conducted the London Philharmonic when he was here, the great Wagner of opera fame. But it wasn't well received. A lot of his music was seen as avant-garde, quite forward-looking, in a country that was very, very wedded to Handel, and very wedded to Mendelssohn as well. Mendelssohn had written Elijah for the Birmingham Festival in 1856, and as far as even Handel's death was 1756. In 1780, there were still huge Handel festivals going on, and Handel obviously has continued to be a staple part of everything that we do. So this really was actually a relatively fair comment. If one was to try and name composers through the Victorian era, there were many, but certainly none that were pushing onto the stage in the way that the Germans were, in the way that the early Impressionists, Satie, Debussy, were coming in from France. In Russia we had Tchaikovsky and so forth. And we weren't really producing anything that was going out onto the stage in a big way. In 1900, your options really might have been, we had the starts of Parry and Elgar around that time. They'd been writing for a good sort of 20 years by then. So you could go see classical concerts. You would hear all sorts of things from Beethoven through to works by Parry and Elgar, but still relatively conservative. And as we'll see later on, I'm going to make a quick comparison between Wagner and Elgar. I think we tend to think of Elgar as this very, very British composer, but actually, really, he was very, very schooled in the Germanic form, as was Parry, who was very, very schooled in the sort of through Brahms. Your other option was to go to the music halls in 1900, where you would have heard a sort of mask of entertainment that in some respects traces its history back to the opposite of Handel, when John Gay put on the Beggar's Opera in the mid-1700s. And his idea of a mask that was a bit of a mix of everything, that was very prominent in the music halls. But whilst a couple of us may know some music hall songs, it's very hard to say that they're quintessentially English songs. And I will tell you Parry's very scathing thoughts on that later. Just to quickly say a couple of things about folk music. Folk music has been with us in a sort of formalised form, if you like, since the late medieval period. That was the first time around then. 1495, we have some noting down of words from folk songs. But really, it's been with us since the late medieval period. We have reports from about 400 AD of some folk songs being sung. Of course, the reports are from the church, because that's generally most of the documents we have from that period, and the church, as you might imagine, very scathing of the kind of subject matter that these folk songs were dealing with. And all these folk songs were being handed down orally through the ages, and this continues today. I remember when I was younger going to some folk gigs locally, and I've never heard some of those folk songs ever again. They're still some of my favourite, and that's something that's always really stuck with me. And how folk song varies through the different parts of the country, I think it's very, very imbuing into the areas. So how did this idea of trying to preserve folk song and also wanting to use folk song come about? Well, there was a sense that there needed, after Oskar Schmidt had said his part in 1904, there was certainly a sense at that time of wanting to counter the European influence. Elgar Parry, very influenced by Wagner, by Beethoven, by Brahms. And in the English realm, we were very stuck to Handel, Mendelssohn. Let's not forget the Brahms Requiem had its first premiere in the UK. So this link was very, very large, and obviously with the royal family going back to the Hanovers, the link between Germany and England and the culture continued. And what people started realising was the heritage in folk music dated back for years and years and years. And so in 1899, the Society of Folk Music was formed. And that was at their first meeting, a certain Hubert Parry of Jerusalem and I Was Glad fame spoke. And he said the following: "The enemy at the doors of folk music is namely the common popular songs of the day. And the enemy is the most repulsive and insidious music made out of snippets of musical slang." So it's quite a scathing attack Parry had on the sort of pop music of the day. And if you like, I think folk music and classical music continues to be under attack from pop music of today, which again, I might also concur a bit of a subjective opinion of snippets of musical slang. Certainly snippets of recycled slang seems to be how we create a lot of pop music now. Anyway, 1899, the Society of Folk Music, and there was a sense that they needed to save it. And one of the main proponents of this was Cecil Sharp, who, of course, some of you will know Cecil Sharp House, which is up near Regent's Park in Camden, and the Society of Folk and Dance, English Folk and Dance, was a combined society eventually, and that's what resides in that building. And in that building is the Vaughan Williams Library, where all the records of Vaughan Williams' folk songs, Cecil Sharp's folk songs, are kept. Cecil Sharp's the important one really in this. He was a composer as much as he was a collector, and lots of us don't know about his compositions because it's sort of overshadowed by Vaughan Williams, Butterworth, and the likes, George Butterworth. But in fact, he was a very prolific collector. Some 5,000 tunes and texts he collected, which if you were going around for 10 years, he was collecting at least one every day or two every day or so. So it's a heck of a collection of songs and texts. But he was also a huge publicist for the movement. When after sort of an initial surge of people going and finding out about things, he actually, and then it was sort of dying off period, he was often encouraging people to get back involved with it, keep researching. He would regularly write articles in the Times explaining how important this was for Britain. And I think what's really fascinating, it sits alongside the Tudor Renaissance. So this was around the same time that the music from the 1600s, certainly the church music, but also secular music like John Dowland, which I spoke about earlier, was being rediscovered. The first we have of that is about 1830. There was a bishop, the dean of Christ Church, Oxford, who realised there was all this music and started rediscovering it. But it wasn't really until the 1900s, and then eventually some of you will have heard of Edmund Fellows, who was an editor of a lot of music. And in fact, although most of us nowadays would not use old editions of music, if you go to cathedrals, most of the editions they're using are Edmund Fellows editions, which is a real credit to him as an editor in the 1930s, a real pioneer of that. So these two things were coming alongside, this rediscovery of Tudor music, or certainly Renaissance Elizabethan music, to be more accurate, and this snapshot, if you like, of folk music. And I think that's quite an important thing to say, is to recognise that actually what we got from this period was not a revival of folk music. I think it's called the revival a lot of time. Actually, really, it was this snapshot in time of folk music that was currently being handed down. And I guess the best analogy would be like a hymn book. A hymn book, thankfully, we don't use the hymn books from 1900 because they'd be very antiquated and with a lot of tunes we didn't know. So we get these sort of new hymn books in church every 30, 40 years or so, and they give us a snapshot of the popular tunes and hymns of that time. So I think it's worth just remembering that. There was a real sense as well with this urgency that the folk song, if you like, the snapshot or revival, obviously it took place on the basis that a lot of people who had some money and interest in these things, namely the middle class at that time, could go out to the working class and listen to these songs and hear them and record them. So, of course, there was really a sense of cultural appropriation going on in that people like Vaughan Williams came back, and it wasn't really just for him about preserving the folk song. It was about how they could use the music and put it into their own sense of their own picture, if you like, rather like an artist, I guess, takes a scene and turns it into their own. So there is some debate around whether that's a good or a bad thing. The way they recorded a lot of this music is quite interesting too. So in America, there was a revival and certainly a lot of research going on. And around this time, of course, Thomas Edison had developed the phonograph, which is those essentially the early version of a record, but it's on a cylinder and it etches the sound into a cylinder as you go along. So the phonograph was an option for people if they were interested in recording these songs. But actually, Vaughan Williams spent a lot of time, Cecil Sharp spent a lot of time just writing them down into notation. And this is really interesting because, of course, in notation, you're limited at the end of the day as to what you can actually put on the score, and someone has to reinterpret that, as opposed to in the oral folk tradition, you're just hearing what someone's doing and imitating it straight out. So there is a sense that when things are written down, a lot of that is lost. What I'm going to do now is play you two recordings. The first is a phonograph recording Vaughan Williams got of the Turtle Dove. Many of you will know the Turtle Dove. Farewell, my dear, I must be gone. It's a lovely, lovely recording. And actually, the Turtle Dove comes from a town in Sussex, just outside Crawley, called Rusper, which, I guess Crawley was a nicer place as well then. But you'll hear in this recording, other than a lot of scratching and distorting because of the phonograph, you'll hear some very interesting things going on in the voice. What I want you to do is just hear that voice. It's very plaintive, just on its own, and that's how the folk songs were sung a lot of the time. And then I'm going to play you some of the Vaughan Williams arrangement, which some of you will be familiar with. I think we did it in Epworth maybe a few years ago. And just let you come to your own opinion on how that really, really differs. here goes. Oh, one sec, just need to get the sound. Good. So you can hear quite how rough those recordings are. They're really, really scratchy. But you'll also be able to see Vaughan Williams, the notations down that Vaughan Williams has made on the score to the left of that screen. So now let's just have a listen to what Vaughan Williams decided to do with that melody. Something quite different. Good, lovely, and lots of you will know that piece as well. Absolutely fabulous piece of music by Vaughan Williams, The Turtle Dove. But of course, the original was just so different. And there's an interesting debate on Radio 4 about this and folk music, which essentially says, there's an element that it's stealing something from the working class life and sort of turning it into this very middle class, if you like, gift that can be appropriated the correct way or listened to in a sort of civilized way, and something is lost in that. But I think so much is gained in that as well. So that just gives you a rough idea of what was going on, this sort of notating it down, taking the material and then turning it into these new textures and using folk song to create this very, very English sound. Well, I'm just going to nip over a minute to have a quick listen to two little things. What I'm going to do is start by playing you the opening 30 seconds of Der Meistersinger Overture by Wagner. And many of you may know this piece. And what I'm going to do straight away afterwards is play you the opening 30 seconds of the prelude to Elgar's oratorio, The Kingdom. Because I think many of us think of this idea that Elgar's music was British, and it's very, very British. But actually what I want to demonstrate here is actually really his work was very Germanic. And from this, I'm going to try and show how these composers were trying to dig their way out of this Germanic style. So let's just have a quick listen to now to a couple of pieces. So we'll start with the Wagner. Good, and so forth. Let's just have a little listen to some Elgar now. Good. I have to use a lot of willpower to stop myself listening to that wonderful, wonderful music by Elgar. I commend the kingdom to you if you don't know that piece already. You can really hear in that the orchestral textures, the similar sort of sense of stature and grandeur that was going on. Very far removed, really, from the things we're going to listen to shortly. And there really was a sense amongst composers that they needed to move away from that and find this new voice. As I say, this was the age where the French had really established themselves in Impressionism. The Russians, through Stravinsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Prokofiev, were starting to really push towards atonality. We had Richard Strauss writing huge operatic movements as well. And really, the English just hadn't come up with a lot up till now, other than Elgar and Parry, who were hugely appreciated in Germany. Indeed, Dream of Gerontius was translated into German and had some performances there. So that goes to show how assimilated it was to that style. Just to go back to Vaughan Williams briefly, he spent, in 1904, he was involved with reorganising the English hymnal, of which he said spending time with some of the best melodies and some of the worst melodies was better training ever than it could have been spending time going through fugues and technical composition exercises. And that probably explains a lot about Vaughan Williams' style. It does have this slight church quality at the heart of it. He was going around the country doing a lot of notation of folk songs between 1904 and 1908. And indeed, his most famous song cycle, the Songs of Travel, comes from that period. 1905 to 1907 was the Songs of Travel. If you don't know the Songs of Travel, I commend them to you. They're a very, very, very good set of English songs. But this is where this sense of the pastoral style comes out. And this was what started to be delivered. Well, I'm going to play you now a little bit of the start of the 5 variations on Dives and Lazarus, which many of you will know as I Heard the Voice of Jesus Saves, a hymn tune which Vaughan Williams used. And just hearing how he really exposes the folk elements of this, the modal elements of the music. So that's to say, we don't have in a minor key, ya da 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 da, ya da dum, those sharp notes at the end. We get ya da 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 da, ya da da dee da 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 dum. It's a very natural scale, and it gives us this sense of timelessness, something quite medieval, because that's what all plain chant is based in. So here we go. Let's have a little bit of the 5 variants of Dives and Lazarus. Here we go. Brilliant. I didn't want to pick the obvious one there, which would have been, of course, the Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis, sounds a very similar sound world, many of you will know. But just to give you a comparison, the Elgar I played you was 1906. The Dives and Lazarus was 1939, but actually theme on Fantasia was 1910. So if you think about comparison between the Elgar and the Vaughan Williams, very, very similar period, but going vastly different directions quite quickly. And of course, this style went on to influence other composers of that period. Vaughan Williams was great friends with George Butterworth, who was going to be one of the great English composers before he was sadly killed at the Battle of the Somme in 1917, I believe. And of course, Gustav Holst, who Vaughan Williams was also very good friends with and spent a lot of time together talking on every subject, according to Vaughan Williams's diary entry. And all of these went on to influence a real lineage of composers after that. Walton, less so Walton, because Walton actually was taking what he wanted from Parry and Elgar, and therefore the sort of more romantic Germanic end. But certainly Finzi. And then when we arrive at Britain, we end up with Britain able to look back at everything that's happened, both the revival of early music, so he was taking Purcell a lot of the time and those influences, but also taking the folk elements when he wanted to and developing this new style out of both of them. Good, just for the sake of balance, because one doesn't like to do the same pieces all the time. We're going to have a little listen to some Gustav Holst now, and a piece written by him in 1906, the Somerset Rhapsody, and this was a direct result of his 1907. This was a direct result of Holst going out and doing this research with the folk melodies. What's really fascinating with the difference here, Vaughan Williams, as you heard in the last piece, gets straight into harmonising it. So big orchestra underneath, all those string textures, rich texture, gives you those amazing feelings. Holst, on the other hand, you'll hear at the start of this just this beautiful top E going on in the strings, rather nicked from the start of Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis. Well, in fact, Holst got there first, so Vaughan Williams would have nicked it, but there we go. And then you'll just hear the tune on the clarinet, very, very plainly played, the folk tune. So Holst taking a slightly different approach here, wanting actually to highlight the folk tune over kind of creating this beautiful sound. Here goes, a little bit of the Somerset Rhapsody by Holst, just for a bit of balance, and I commend the rest of this piece to you after the session. and so on. And of course, some of you will, more observant amongst you, will notice, of course, that is It's a Rosebud in June, which we are singing as the first of our folk songs with Hal Davies arrangements. So nice to make those two comparisons. So you can hear really that expose, but again, putting that next to the Elgar, the Kingdom 1906, this 1907, really divergent paths that were being taken through this influence. I'm going to start wrapping this up quite soon, but I'm just going to nip, because it was too tempting not to, and mention Percy Grainger. He was an Australian composer, and what he started getting obsessed with was, rather than Vaughan Williams and Cecil Sharp, who were taking these songs and notating them down and seeing that as long as the melodic content was at the forefront, that was what was important, Grainger was starting to get obsessed with the way it was performed, the particular trills, the minutiae, the little slurs, the extra notes that are put in, the way the dialect feeds into the performance as well. And Grainger, in fact, I've sung a few pieces by Grainger, and in his copies, he very rarely writes dynamics. He'll often write comments like "to the fore." So he's trying to get the sounds to change rather than just something to get louder. And his copies are littered with markings that are written out. So it's quite an interesting thing. Well, I have to do this. And I have to play you his arrangement of the Australian up-country song. And if you have a good look at the person who walks off at the lower left-hand part of the screen, you might recognise him. Here it goes. Just here in that arrangement, the way that the choir texture alters towards the Vaughan Williams in many ways. It's far less modal, but we all had a good time singing it. It definitely wasn't 2011, I can tell you that, because of the people who were there, but it was a little earlier than that. Good. So that was Percy Grainger and his obsession with the sort of minutiae of this. Well, it was just as well the folk song revival happened at the time it did, with the coming of First World War that very, very much decimated a lot of the workforce, particularly in the countryside. And that tradition really, we worry, would have been lost totally had it not been for that snapshot of music that was taken at that time. By the time World War II had finished, there was a real sense of getting back into the countryside. It was rather like COVID in a way, that everyone's moved out to the countryside. And to help with this, there was what was called the Second Revival. This was a far looser revival. This was more a recognition amongst people that the cultural heritage of a country needed preserving and displaying as well. And so the BBC did their best with this. So I only mention this briefly, it's quite amusing. Their light music programme in 1950 was light music at that point was then considered folk music arrangements. And that would involve taking the original singer's song and then turning it into some sort of umpire band waltz, which rather decries the entire point of taking these folk songs in the first place. And the BBC didn't see it as appropriate at that time for the original singers to sing them. So they were professional singers and a professional orchestra as well. And it resulted in a rather strange effect. I've heard one of them, but I'm not able to get the sound for you today. But at least it was a start towards recognising that we needed to do something. And of course, this folk revival really spread out into pop culture as well in a way. And of course, there's no greater thing I could play you to demonstrate this other than, of course, this artist. Lovely, we could be all there all day listening to Simon and Garfunkel as well. Lastly, of course, we come to Benjamin Britten, and it's important I mention him at the end of this because we are doing a couple of the Britten folk songs, and this takes us right to the end of our programme for this term. We've discussed everything up to now. Well, Britten's arrangements sort of come out of this second revival in some ways. Of course, they were started as encores when they were in America during World War II. And they went down rather well with the American public there. Peter Pears singing, Benjamin Britten playing. But what I find quite interesting about the Britten arrangements is it's almost like in the second revival, they've had second thoughts about the piano part. And very often in his folk songs, the piano part strays and gives its own sense of being an entire art song to the point where the folk tune hasn't become the focus of it. And I think the beauty of a lot of the Vaughan Williams arrangements and the Holst is that the folk song is still the most prominent part. And I think what Britten's saying is, well, does the accompaniment need to be as boring anymore? Can we reinvent the classical side of this? If we take what Vaughan Williams did and say, actually, this was a classical piece in itself, it ignored the folk song to start with, can I now reinvent that rather than reinventing the original folk tune? And I think this works particularly well in pieces like the Ashgrove, which we've done, and the Sally Gardens, of course, is just iconic. But some of his later folk songs start, I find, just for me, and start to get to a point where it's quite difficult to decipher what the original tune was. I'll never forget a masterclass at Guildhall where a soprano brought The Last Rose of Summer and struggled through it with this pianist, and the person taking the masterclass just sat down at the piano after. She said, wouldn't it be nice if it just went dum ba da yum bum ba da da and just put these wonderful straight chords down on the piano? And it was an absolute relief to hear that after the sort of confusing elements of the Britten accompaniment. Now, that's not me having a go at Britten at all, because I think there's a time and a place for those arrangements. But what I'm going to do to finish today is play you a little bit of Bonnie at Morn, which is a later folk song arrangement by Britten. And I'm going to let you decide, as the final part of all of this, whether you feel that the accompaniment adversely or complements the folk song, and how really that sits into the tradition, this sort of classical versus folk song tradition that we still have today, and we see in pieces like the one Howe has given us. So to finish, Bonnie at Morn by Benjamin Britten. I shall leave you wanting a little more there. But on that note, I shall finish my talk. Thank you all for being here, and let you make your own conclusions about folk song revival. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Lawrence. That was really interesting. Two things that I just picked up on straight away were the fact that when Wagner came here, it wasn't well received. I sort of wasn't. I mean, I kind of probably was aware that he'd come over and done some performances, but wasn't aware that it hadn't been greatly received when he first came.
When he first came here, he was fleeing from the city at the time and trying to gain funds to build Bayreuth as well.
Right.
So it was a bit of a strange time, but he was very well received by Queen Victoria, who did enjoy his music.
Okay,
But the critics at the time were very scathing.
And talking about the composers we've looked at, were Finzi was slightly before Britain, was he, or not? Do you think, are they more contemporary than I know? What sort of, Finzi was a little bit before, was he? Just sort of 10 or 20 years, or is that wrong?
No, I don't think it's wrong. I think it's more that just Finzi didn't publish a huge amount, so his output is quite small. And most of Finzi's output feels like it was certainly 10 years or so, 20 years before.
Right. Might be a lot to do with the sound world in that case.
Okay.
Were there any other composers that, obviously sort of slightly lesser composers from around that mid 20th century British kind of pool that were also working with folk songs? I'm trying to think if there's anybody else really that I've come across or that you've sung from around that period.
Absolutely. I mean, the important thing was what developed out of it. So this pastoral style, it's called, and I think that I didn't actually look that up, but for me, that's because the sound of these melodies tends to evoke these sort of nice, the gentle rolling hills of the Cotswolds or Sussex.
Yeah.
And I think so. So a lot of people influence it. We have Peter Warlock, a very big influence. Yeah. Ernest Moran as well. Really, any of those English song composers, you discover it inside there.
Do you think there are any composers like that? I mean, people like Moran and Dark and things and Warlock are definitely less well known than Britten, Vaughan Williams and Holst. Are there any of them that you think are really sort of have done top draw folk interpretations that are unduly overlooked?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'd be interested to see what you thought as well. I'm always an advocate for the music of Peter Warlock because he was doing things that were on the fringe of that. So whilst he had the influence of the folk music, a lot of the time his music and choice of texts, particularly in his songs, are really fascinating and worthy of some time.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of really good stuff by him. Also reminded me that when I used to play the piano a lot more seriously, I used to do quite a lot of Percy Granger's. He as well as arranging all those folk songs for choirs. There are books and books of piano folk song arrangements, and they're all brilliant. Some of them are monumentally difficult, but all really clever. But yes, Lawrence, you touched on those performance instructions that he had, and I always remember there was one that I used to play, and I can't remember, I'd have to look it up now, but the performance instruction at the top said violently, which I thought was quite an interesting way to describe performance practice as violent. So I haven't seen that as a marking on any of the music before or since, but yeah, he's quite a character, as we well know. Do any of you have any questions? Sorry, I know I've jumped straight in there hot on Lawrence's heels, but do unmute and ask away if you have anything for Lawrence.
Can I ask something?
Hi,
hello. You've obviously been talking about the English folk song development, etc. Was there anything comparable in Welsh and Scottish folk song?
Yeah, absolutely. There were people who were collecting Welsh and Scottish folk song, and of course, Britain's folk song arrangements aren't limited to English song. There's a set of Irish songs, there's a set of Scottish songs as well, and there were certainly Welsh songs. Certainly William Matthias, who's a far less well-known composer, but had a little influence into that in the 60s as well. So it was, yes, there was certainly a sense of collection going on around the British Isles.
Thank you.
So Matthias was Welsh, was he?
Matthias was Welsh, but
yeah, I wasn't sure. I thought, yeah, that might have been the case. Yeah, great, really fascinating. Thank you. And it was nice that you finished with the Garfunkel track, because we did a Garfunkel track as part of the US ones last week. So they'd obviously have been through a fair few folk songs in their career. Brilliant. Does anybody else have any questions or any comments or observations? Otherwise, thank you, Lawrence. That was really fascinating and really informative, and especially directly alongside what we discussed with the US, with their history and what they dealt with. And actually, you know, a lot of it were the same melodies that went to the US and then quickly evolved as we discussed and explored. So there is some common ground between the two, definitely. And yes, I mean, again, there's a fascinating thought as to with an arrangement, a folk song adaptation arrangement, whether it's a choir or solo voice, you know, when's the point at which you're actually sort of overdoing it slightly, and it no longer serves to kind of highlight and sort of glorify, for want of a better word, the folk melody, and it actually turns it into something that's much kind of bigger and in a way less beautiful. I don't know. I don't know. That's a very matter of personal opinion, really, but I do share your view that with a lot of those Britain folk song arrangements, which I've played over the years, some of them are really quite involved to the point where they do seriously run the risk of sort of eclipsing the vocal line and the singer, not just in terms of volume of them being loud, but just in terms of they're so texturally dense and rhythmically and harmonically peculiar that it does start to push the folk melodies into a whole new realm. But it's a matter of taste, I suppose.
I think that's right, and of course that was exemplified in Dudley Moore's sketch of Little Miss, you know, and I think they were sort of heading towards that idea that actually it gets to a point where it becomes comic.
Yes.
So it's a steady balance. Yeah.
It is. And actually, again, you know, have we partly answered this in that, you know, between us, Lawrence, I reckon we could name 10 Britain folk song arrangements that everybody sings that are really, really good. But actually, there are possibly hundreds. There are volumes, and probably not hundreds, but there are certainly many dozens of them. There are books and books of those Britain folk song arrangements, some of which I've never even heard of, let alone played or heard performed. And perhaps they're the ones that people just feel aren't quite as successful.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's something like 80 or so. I've got the whole book here.
Oh, have you got?
Um,
I've got a couple of volumes here, I
this,
think.
this is a
Yeah.
thick volume, as everyone can see. It runs to.
How
Uh,
many are there roughly? 40 or 50 or more than that?
it runs to 236 pages,
Wow. Oh, right.
and so that gives you a good idea. But there must be, yeah, I mean, there must be at least sort of 60 or
Oh, yeah.
60 or so there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
they're worth exploring. I might put some on and just have a listen and acquaint myself with some of the less well-known ones along the way. Yeah,
Yeah.
Lynn.
Yeah. How do you think that the Britain arrangements sort of reflect or otherwise on the Germanic leader stuff that was very much, the voice had one part, the accompaniment had something entirely different. Do you think there's a relationship or not?
I certainly think it is. I think that's a really, really good point. And of course, we know that Schubert was Britain's favourite composer. So, yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of the point I was trying to say about the folk song has no longer become the focus for Britain. It's more about what's the next thing you do with Vaughan Williams's arrangements of folk songs. So, Vaughan Williams took the folk song, turned it into classical music. Now, what do you do with that to turn it into the next version? And I think that's absolutely right. What Britain said, well, actually, the piano part has to become more complex. It's not just accompanying the song; it has to become its own independent part. And I think that's where that tension in the relationship starts to come in. So I think you're absolutely right on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I'd never stopped to think about that before. I think from a pianist's perspective, having accompanied lots of Lieder and through to all these Britain things, I think there's definitely much more of a partnership with that, the Schubert, Schumann, even Mozart kind of Lieder, where the piano part is pretty much in dialogue with the voice a lot of the time. And yes, it's creating a mood and it's setting the harmonies and everything, but there is a dialogue with the voice. Whereas I do think with the Britain arrangements, on the whole, the piano is creating a sound world in the background and is not directly speaking to and from the voice part. I think there are exceptions. I can think of one or two that I've done where there is a bit more of a dialogue between the piano and the voice part. But, with things like the Ashgrove that we're doing, I think that's such a stunningly beautiful accompaniment, and it sounds like a little sort of music jewelry box, but it does absolutely nothing in relation to the voice part. It just kind of starts and paints this beautiful background picture all the way through. And in some ways, that's its beauty because it just lets the vocal line sing and doesn't get in the way. It doesn't try and compete with it. It just produces a lovely sort of very ethereal backdrop to the voice part. So in that respect, very different. And also, I guess Britain was right. There was more potential for Britain. He was writing for a modern piano with 88 notes, whereas Schubert and Schumann's piano was much smaller, much more limited in terms of what was possible. But yeah, it's a really interesting thought, actually, that idea of the partnership. I would say that the partnership dialogue is more obviously there in Schubert and Schumann, and it becomes a bit more kind of soundscapey with Britain. Not arguably less successfully so, but just in a different treatment of the piano part. Brilliant. Well, at T minus 1 minute to 3 p.m. Lawrence, thank you very much again. That was brilliant. It's our last session is almost upon us, and I'm about to send a little note round because I'm going to have to move. It was meant to be Monday the 27th or 28th, I think, and I'm no longer available then. It was meant to be Monday the 28th. So I'm probably going to do it next Monday instead. So just pencil in your diaries now if you can, that we'll do that one, same time, same place, just next Monday instead of 2 weeks' time. But again, I'll send a note round after Wednesday when I've just cleared that with everybody. And also, as ever, all these recordings are available online. So if you're not able to tune in next Monday, it'll still be there on catch up, as will this session. So thanks again. Enjoy the sun. I've got my little desktop fan pointing right at my face here in an attempt to stay cool. Thanks again, Lawrence, and see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.